Hey everybody, Bob Chick along with Sugar Sean Ray, Hall of Famer. We are at Monday Night Muscle discussing the Mount Rushmore of industry leaders, Sean. So not bodybuilders in particular.
Right.
That's a whole nother discussion because trying to find the best 4 bodybuilders is almost impossible. I mean, best for anybody. Let's face it. You do this with football, basketball. It's always tough because you got to leave somebody off the mountain that you kind of think should be there. It's like we need more faces. You know.
I understand that, but we could still, based on our opinion, we could still pick out 4.
I think this is easier than the bodybuilders.
So we're going to talk about the industry.
Industry leaders, okay, Mount Rushmore, people that had the most influence on the industry of bodybuilding. Now we got to start way back just to get let's get some perspectives out there, okay? We got to start back with the man who the Olympia statue was named after, of course, and that would be Eugene Sandow, who goes way back into the 1800s. Considered at that time the modern bodybuilder
and strongman.
They
used the word strongman more than anything.
Because nobody was really just a bodybuilder back then. You kind of did everything. You did
like
the strongman with a circus act, like with the one hand barbell and then the Louis Sir one finger lift, with 500 pounds. So Eugene Sandow's got to be a consideration. I mean, he was the first guy. Again, the Olympia statue was named after him.
Absolutely.
So we got to put him in there as a consideration.
Okay.
Now that's again early 1900s.
That's before our time.
A little bit, yeah. But then we get up to, we'll call it the modern era. Now, the modern era actually starts in the 40s, all right? But again, to that time, it's almost 50 years later.
Right.
With, of course, Joe Weider.
Okay. Is it just Joe or is it Joe and Ben?
Well, again.
I know they're not twins,
always up for discussion because it's hard to mention one without the other.
Right.
Now, we both had a lot of time with Joe, and you, most of your career was under contract with Joe in the magazines. Certainly Joe Weider's an in. I mean, there's no way you can have this Mount Rushmore without Joe Weider.
Yeah, because he and his brothers started Muscle Builder, I believe it was, the magazine.
Yeah.
And without the magazine, the world doesn't know about all these wonderful physiques that ultimately became the IFBB that his brother was in charge of. While Joe was pumping out the magazine and building the Weider brand with the weights and the powders and all that, his brother Ben was a missionary traveling the world and planting these seeds in all of these countries to find the new up-and-coming talent that would one day be unified with all the Mr. America, Mr. Universe, Mr. World, and then of course Joe would give birth to the Mr. Olympia in '65. So yeah, you can't mention one without the other.
And this was genius at the time, okay? Because now let's go back in time. Joe Weider starts out as a publisher. Okay, so he puts out the magazine, like I say, it was Muscle Builder, I believe, was the first, then it went to Muscle Builder / Power.
Right.
Then it just went to Muscle.
And later on, Muscle Fitness.
And then Muscle and Fitness. It changed a little bit along the way, but it was the same magazine.
Right.
And it was all bodybuilding right off the bat. I mean, there was nothing else. There was no women's anything at that point. If anything, they had like the Body Beautiful contest back then.
And he paid homage to Eugene Sandow.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
That was his mentor.
So Joe puts out the magazine. Now, that was their thing. And then they expanded and they started making the weights and the barbells and then the supplements and things like that. Is anybody that saw the movie Bigger that they put out a couple years ago, and it chronicled the life and times of Joe Weider and Ben and putting together the IFBB and bodybuilding and all that.
That was a lot.
But Ben's role doesn't come along for a little bit. It was genius that they put that together to organize bodybuilders from all over the world.
Right.
For a federation to then help the magazine. So one helped the other. So I think if you're going to talk about Joe, you have to have Ben. I think they got to go as a pair.
Yeah, that's true. And we are talking about Mount Rushmore, which there's only 4 people. So we're already up to 3.
Well, again, now we're speculating on some of these. I don't know. I mean, we'll see who else we come up with because somebody's going to have to go here. Right?
Yeah. But with respect to what you were talking about in terms of each of these dominoes lining up, you're right. You had Joe Weider creating the modern bodybuilding magazine, and then you had the supplements follow along with the weight set. Remember the Weider weight set?
Oh, yeah.
And then while all that was happening, you had Ben flying all around the world creating these little entities, these contests, which later became the International Federation of Bodybuilding. And now you had a feeder, a funnel to go into the pros, which ultimately would lead into the Mr. America, Mr. World, Mr. Universe all competing competing in the Super Bowl, which would become the Mr. Olympia in 1965, which didn't have a lot of athletes in it. This is the one that Larry Scott won in Brooklyn back in 1965.
And he only had, there was only a handful.
Yeah, a handful of guys.
And then Harold Poole, I believe, was one. I think Earl Maynard was in some of those early ones.
And in the audience was a young Lou Ferrigno, the Incredible Hulk, watching.
Oh, well, he was really young back then. But, you had Earl Maynard back then. You had Larry Scott, obviously. So the idea was, for those who want a quick history lesson, there was like 4 Mr. Universes at one time from different federations. There was the AAU, there was the NABA, NABBA. Then there was IFBB Pro, IFBB Amateur.
Yeah, you had all these different alphabets.
So at any time, there was 4 or 5, and I'm leaving off things like the WBBG. I mean, there was a lot of federations starting to come up. Every one of them claiming a Mr. Universe.
Right.
So Joe's idea and Ben's was to create a one show to settle the score.
That's right.
And the initial idea was to have all these Mr. Universes come together and see who truly is the best of the best.
Right.
And they come up with, of course, the Mr. Olympia.
Well, once the Olympia comes along, so now you've got solidly Eugene Sandow, who is the originator of it all. Because without him, Joe Weider doesn't have the dream and the vision to go into this bodybuilding type thing. And without Joe, or without Ben, we don't have Joe. So there's 3 on Mount Rushmore right there.
All right. Well, like I said, somebody's going to have to go here. But let's move along, okay, chronologically. The next guy I'm going to nominate, you have to have. Like, there's no way around it. You can't not have him on. He was too instrumental in overall growth of bodybuilding, and that's Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yeah, without Arnold Schwarzenegger, we don't probably know Joe and Ben as well, because clearly this is the golden child, right? They didn't manufacture Arnold. Arnold wasn't somebody that they just spoon-fed and created a champion. Arnold was the guy that wanted to be Eugene Sandow of that time, of that era. Yep. And Joe saw that in Arnold, brought him over from Austria, and actually put him to work. He didn't come over here just to lay on the beach and take pictures. Sure. Arnold actually worked as a mason.
I got to give honorable mention in there to my man Steve Reeves, okay, because he's a real close one to Arnold in terms of, Reeves comes in, and obviously he competed in bodybuilding, right? He won the America, I think, in the Universe. And more importantly, most people know that from being Hercules,
right,
on the big screen. So he kind of does bring bodybuilding a little mainstream. So does Reg Park to a point, but Reeves was huge.
But they're not Rushmore material because they didn't have the longevity. What Arnold did with what as little that he had, right? Here's this guy, 19 years old, comes over here, and he literally has to run into a Mack truck in Sergio Oliva from Cuba. But Arnold didn't just win. Arnold became much more, and of course his body of work now at the ripe old age of, 72, we can't even fit the body of work that Arnold's done and the things that he's done for the sport of bodybuilding.
Honorable mention to Charles Gaines and George Butler, because without the moving pumping iron, Arnold doesn't have the impact he does. That made Arnold a star.
Yeah.
And he was the star. Obviously there was other things with Ferrigno and of course Ed Corney and all that stuff that made Pumping Iron the great documentary that it was.
And it put Gold's Gym on the map.
Gold's Gym, and everything is created from Pumping Iron. Did more for bodybuilding than almost anything.
But Arnold was already a 4-time Mr. Olympia champion.
And he's the star.
Yes.
Okay, so we got to have Arnold on there. So now we already got 4 guys.
Well, and listen, let's not cut Arnold short here, because what Arnold did with those titles is nothing short of amazing. Those were just opening doors. I remember his check was like $1,000 for being Mr. Olympia. Arnold went on to do amazing things for the sport of bodybuilding. Not only was he a commentator on like Wide World of Sports.
This was on prime time on ABC back in the day with the yellow jackets, with the insignia and all that. We need to bring those back.
He took 5 years off, came back and won the title again in 1980, and then he wound up marrying a Kennedy.
Now, I got to knock off Eugene Sandow, okay, and I'll tell you why. Even though he was an originator way back, he was kind of before the days of actual bodybuilding. All right, so
strongman.
Yeah, he was kind of, again, yes, he was in the strongman and the bodybuilding as we know it, but he wasn't modern enough that I'm going to give him credit. I got to start with Joe and Ben, because they were and they started in the 40s.
Okay.
But obviously by the time we get modernized, it's the 60s basically.
Now we got Joe and Ben and Arnold.
So Joe, Ben, and Arnold. Okay, Eugene, God bless you. Okay, but I got to put this next guy in.
He's
there.
in the foundation.
This is the foundation. Yeah, we're talking about the industry leaders and what they did to change the sport and the direction to where we are now. My 4th nomination, Jim Manion.
And without Jim Manion, we don't have Lee Haney in 1982 winning the very first national championship. Who else won those national championships? So 82 was Haney. It was Bob Paris in 83, Mike Christian in 84, Phil Williams in 85, 86, Gary Stridham, 87, Sean Ray, 88, Vince Taylor, 89. You want me to keep going? I mean, we can keep going. But Troy Zucolato in 89.
You guys in a little secret because he could keep going.
Al Q Gurley in 90.
Up until, who won last year?
Who won last? I have no idea who won.
Bingo.
You lost me.
See, now that's the difference between yesterday and today, okay?
It's really changed a lot.
But Jim Manion changes the landscape. Now, a lot of people don't know this. Jim Manion came from the AAU, okay, which was the only amateur federation back in the day.
Right.
Okay, that was the feeder to the IFBB and all that.
And he had a lot of hurdles to fight legally just to get the NPC where it is.
And Jim was a bodybuilder, is a bodybuilder, okay? He still trains today, but he won titles back then. He competed against Robbie Robinson and some of those guys.
That's right.
Back in the day, Jim could hold his own. So he's a bodybuilder's bodybuilder. That's why he always got the respect of everybody in the sport.
And he also became a bodybuilding promoter, not just creating the federation, but he had to go around putting his posters up in gyms and promoting the little contests.
Yeah, that was old school back then. There was no internet. There was no nothing. You actually literally went around with a stack of posters and they put them up in the gyms and the vitamin stores and things like that. But what Jim does of note is he branches off. Okay, the NPC is born. The AAU, I don't say turn their back, but they kind of turn the page to bodybuilding because the AAU was the preeminent amateur federation of everything.
I competed in the AAU in 1983 in my second competition.
Yeah, but my first, same thing. We were the same era. My first 3-4 shows were AAU shows. There was no NPC. There was nowhere else to compete. They break off and they start the NPC. And this changes bodybuilding history forever. The NPC becomes the sister organization to the IFBB Pro League now.
Right. It's a feeder like the feeder farm for like the NCAA to the NFL.
Exactly right. And this changes bodybuilding. It explodes because you're talking early 80s now. Okay? It literally only took a year or two.
Right.
Because when you get into, you just rattled off the first 5 names of the NPC champs, which anybody can pretty much rattle off if you know bodybuilding history. But you can't tell me who won the AAU America in those years.
Yeah, absolutely couldn't because, once I got my feet in the water, so to speak, 1983 is when I met, or 84 is when I met Jim Manion. I started competing in 83. 1984 at the Teen National Championships, Detroit, Michigan, is where I got my first glimpse at you at the Teenage Nationals. And Jim actually was the one handing out the awards there.
That's right.
And of course, again in 85 in Atlanta, and 86 in Niagara Falls at the Junior Nationals. And of course, in 87 when I won the Nationals. The irony about Jim is that at his shows, he's at the show. He's the one handing out the awards, much like Joe Weider would hand out the Sandow Trophy every year. So can you imagine when you go all the way back to 1982, when Lee Haney won his national championship, to present is Jim Manion on the stage still handing out that award.
Well, again, we're talking about a different day. Again, there's no internet. There's no ways of just, hey, man, you interested? Jim got in the car, with his crew, and they drove to every state, pretty much, other than Hawaii. Hard to drive there.
Right.
And they recruited people. That's what they did. They met people, gym owners, people in the industry, people that were interested in judging or competitors. And they started getting chairman of states. And he started literally they did it one state at a time.
Yeah.
Talk about an effort.
Yeah.
Again, old school, boots on the ground, driving city to city, and they put it together. And listen, we knew a handful of guys that won AAU titles after that. They got decimated.
Yeah, the AAU totally disappeared. I remember the last big name from the AAU when I started. Jeff King had beaten my mentor John Brown. Right. Vince Taylor actually won the AAU America prior to the 88 national championships that he won. Joe Miko. There's a few names that I can recall from back in the day.
James DeMello.
They disappeared quickly because the ones that were in the AAU transferred over into the NPC because there was only one way to get to the Mr. Olympia.
87, we had a whole bunch of those guys came over. We competed against them.
Right.
That was a big influx that year into the NPC. The NPC, within 2 years, became the preeminent organization. Again, you're one step away from the pros, which means you're 2 steps away from the Olympia stage, which is everything.
That was the promised land. And mind you, these are amateur federations, no money involved. Right. However, when you won the national championships, it was the beginning of your pro career. You would earn your pro card. And that would begin the business of bodybuilding, where you could take yourself and insert yourself into these smaller shows where they'd highlight you and pay you to show these other amateurs what a professional bodybuilder looks like. And I was able to move out of my mother's house into an apartment because I was able to start performing on stage at NPC shows around the country and eventually as a pro around the world. That's how it began.
The Mr. America gave way to the national championships.
Yes.
The Mr. USA gave way to the USA bodybuilding championships. North America was added, and so on and so on.
Team Universe. Yeah.
Team Universe, now the Universe. So they've had some changes along the way. But one thing that's indistinguishable is that the NPC became the gateway to the IFBB. Jim Manion, Joe and Ben Weider, they all work cohesively to build what you guys all see today. So we talk about the Mount Rushmore. Like I say, with all due respect to the early pioneers. But
And listen, there's a lot of pioneers in between there. Not to mention, I mean, Joe Gold. Without Joe Gold, we don't have Gold's Gym.
True.
Without Gold's Gym, we don't have Arnold Schwarzenegger. So there's some important figures that are not going to wind up on this monument. But without Joe Gold, we don't have World's Gym, including that. So think about it. World's Gym, no Gold's Gym. I mean, there's a lot of bodybuilders we don't have because we don't have that history.
I mean, a lot goes into it. I mean,
how about the Davish brothers at the Powerhouse Gym?
Listen, you can go on and on. I mean, there are people that were very instrumental, but none of them exist without Jim Manion putting together the NPC, putting that tough work in, putting in the grind hour and hour. And again, this took some years, but he did it. He did it well. And it stood the test of time. All these other little federations all started to go away real quick. WBBG, all these other federations, Dan Lurie and all them. And some of these weren't bad guys. I mean, listen, they did their own thing, and that's cool. But if you couldn't get to the Olympia, what was the point?
True, but you mentioned earlier about like honorable mention, Steve Reeves and maybe Reg Park. How do we leave out Jack LaLanne? Because I mean, Jack LaLanne for the fitness industry on TV late night, and with his wife Elaine. I mean, Arnold. They were one of the first people that Arnold gave his lifetime achievement award
with the Juice Giant. That alone should put him in the Hall of Fame.
And he had the gyms and how he lived. He was like 90-something years old. I mean,
he was still tugging boats in the harbor.
Yeah.
All right.
Jack LaLanne's legit.
It was late 80s. I actually did an infomercial for the Juice Giant, whatever he called it, on Venice Beach with Jack LaLanne. Okay, this is a great story for you. And his wife is there, Elaine LaLanne, one of my favorite names to this day.
LaLanne.
She's still alive, by the way.
Yes, that's crazy.
So we're on Venice Beach, and we're doing this infomercial that he used to put out there, right, with his blue tracksuit on and the whole thing. Now, he's got to be close to 90 at this point, right? 89, I think he was, maybe even 90. And all he did was make jokes the entire time. He was like Rodney Dangerfield out there, right? And I'm standing there, and we did this piece where we're going to arm wrestle. And, of course, he beats me, and then, he's the juicer, of course, Even he was on the juice.
Yeah, he was on the juice back then.
So I'm talking to Jack, and his wife is standing next to him, and he goes, he starts asking me questions about bodybuilding. He's like, young man, you look great, this and that. And he's kind of going, he's very energetic, And he goes, he says, at our age, he says, people think that we don't have sex anymore. And I go, really? And I'm looking at his wife, and she's got that look on her face like, what's coming, she's heard 10,000 times, right?
Right.
And he goes, but I'll tell you this right now. He says, we have sex nearly every single day. And I go, really? He goes, yep. Nearly had it on Monday, nearly had it on Tuesday, nearly had it on Wednesday.
That's Jack. That is Jack.
Yeah. And his wife just shakes her head, like I said, like this is not the first time she's heard this joke.
Right.
Of course, he's howling, but I'll always remember that about Jack LaLanne. He was fantastic. But again, instrumental in the world of bodybuilding, per se? Or the industry of health and fitness?
Well, I got to say that he's instrumental because from that, you wind up with bodybuilding because some guys start working out because they see someone fit. They're being taught on late night television. They're learning about nutrition, and you evolve into this bodybuilder. Some people don't just start off as a bodybuilder. Maybe they're doing playing sports just to get fit. Sports are over. They evolve into bodybuilding. That's how it happened for me. But Jack LaLanne was a worldwide recognizable figure that changed the landscape of how we view working out, so to speak.
Well, you had a show on TV.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I mean, I at 16 years old, I went to get a job. My first job. I thought I was going to actually work, Bob, instead of bodybuilding.
Now, that shocks me in itself.
I went there. I got the job. I was there for a week as a trainer, but when they started telling me to empty the trash and wipe down the windows, which is, my dad was a janitor, I knew exactly what I was doing. I didn't sign up to be a janitor. I signed up to be a trainer, and of course I quit.
True or not true?
Jack LaLanne.
You have never actually held a job, a real job, outside of bodybuilding.
I don't know. Well, a real job to me is like getting up at 5:30.
No, I mean a regular, like something out there. You've never held a job outside the world of bodybuilding.
That's true.
Okay, something you didn't know, but listen.
Well, they say if you are able to monetize your passion, you'll never work a day in your life.
True.
I mean,
teach a man to fish.
but I got to tell you, I got to tell you, this is the hardest passion I think you could ever choose. This is not something that, it's not for the faint of heart, which is why we see people come and go. But that Mount Rushmore, I think we got to have 5 iconic figures on that wall.
I got to listen.
You
We got
want
to
to keep
stick
it
to
to
4,
4?
bro. That's what's carved in there.
All right.
So Joe and Ben.
Okay.
Arnold, Jim Manion.
All right. Well, we got a lot of great influential people that are not on that wall, and of course, the story is still being written as we venture into this year's Mr. Olympia.
Open
with Jake
for
Woods coming into
discussion,
the
open
thing.
for debate. You guys can all chime in because I know we're going to hear this one. What about this guy? What about that
There's
guy?
a lot of you might be on that wall one day.
Maybe
all the things you've done.
me and you possibly.
15 years the MC of the Olympia. That's got to be some
Mount
kind of
Rushmore
record.
of bodybuilding broadcasters. Bro, we're in.
Hey,
We're in.
we're hanging in there, baby.
We got this. We welcome all your comments. We welcome all your input, guys. You want to debate? Me and Sugar are here. We'll debate you all night long. It's what we do. We'll catch you soon.